Caroline Matilda was barely a teenager when she was sent away to become a queen, and almost immediately she was trapped in a marriage that would become a nightmare. Then Caroline Matilda fell in love with another man, the king's own physician. Their secret affair would unleash whispered accusations, political conspiracies, and one of the greatest scandals in the Danish royal court. Her enemies would turn against her, her marriage would collapse, and the young queen would be stripped of her crown and sent into exile. But the darkest part of her story was yet to come. This is the tragic and scandalous story of Caroline Matilda. The future Queen of Denmark and Norway was born at Leicester House in London on the 22nd of July 1751. She was the ninth and youngest child of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and his wife Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. Unlike many of her siblings, Caroline would never know her father. Frederick, the eldest son and heir of King George II, died suddenly on the 31st of March 1751, just 3 months before Caroline was born. He was only 44 years old. For generations, the story was told that Frederick's death had been caused by a lung abscess brought on after he was struck by a cricket ball. It is a colourful explanation, though historians are not as confident about this theory anymore. Caroline's widowed mother raised her large family thereafter in seclusion at Leicester House, trying to keep the children away from the intrigues of the court of her father-in-law, King George II. As she grew older, Caroline Matilda developed a lively and carefree personality. She was described as temperamental but natural and informal, qualities that made her stand out from the more rigid expectations of royal life. Unlike many princesses of her time, she seemed to have little interest in politics or the elaborate schemes of court. Instead, she loved riding, learning to play the harpsichord, sang and learned to speak French, German and Italian, alongside her native English. In 1760, Caroline Matilda's quiet childhood came to an abrupt end. Her grandfather, King George II, died, and her eldest brother ascended to the throne as George III. For 9-year-old Caroline Matilda, everything suddenly changed. She was no longer simply a princess growing up in seclusion. She was now the sister of a reigning king, making her a valuable prize on the European marriage market. Soon discussions began about whom she might marry. Caroline had little say in the matter. Her future would be decided by the political interests of her family, and the man eventually chosen for her would take her into a marriage that would become a nightmare. By 1764, plans were underway to secure Caroline Matilda a husband, and Denmark, whose kings had long ruled over Norway as well as a dual kingdom, soon emerged as the likely destination. The Danish Crown Prince Christian was himself Caroline's first cousin, as his mother Louise had been the sister of Caroline's father. The match would strengthen the existing alliance between Britain and Denmark. But Caroline was not the Danish court's first choice. They had initially considered her elder sister Louisa Anne, until their representative in London warned that her health was too delicate. Attention then turned to 13-year-old Caroline Matilda. In January 1765, their engagement was officially announced. Caroline was now destined to become the future Queen of Denmark. Because Caroline was still so young, she did not immediately leave for Denmark. But everything changed in January 1766 when King Frederick V died, and her future husband suddenly became King Christian VII. He was not yet 17. Then, on the 1st of October of that year, 15-year-old Caroline Matilda was married to Christian by proxy at St. James's Palace in London. The very next morning, she left England for a country she had never seen, travelling to meet a husband she had never met. They finally came face to face at Roskilde in early November. On the 8th, Caroline made her grand entrance into Copenhagen to enormous cheers from the crowds. That evening, she and Christian were formally married at Christiansborg Palace. Finally, on the 1st of May 1767, the young king and queen were crowned together. Caroline Matilda was now officially Queen of Denmark, but she could not have known that her new royal life would soon descend into scandal, betrayal and disaster. Behind the pageantry of Caroline Matilda's arrival in Denmark and her marriage, Serious problems were already emerging. Christian was mentally ill, and modern writers have generally concluded that he suffered from schizophrenia, which made his behaviour increasingly erratic. He showed little interest in his young wife and delayed consummating their marriage, instead spending his nights roaming the taverns and brothels of Copenhagen with a notorious circle of court favourites. Among them was Anna Katharina Benthagen, a courtesan who humoured the king's liking for women who dressed in men's clothes, and joined his drunken rampages around the city dressed as a naval officer. In fact, Christian had never wanted the marriage in the first place. He had been pressured into it by his court, who hoped that taking a wife might somehow improve his troubled state of mind. Some at court even whispered that the king preferred the company of men to women. For Caroline, however, the result was the same. She had been sent to Denmark to become a queen, only to find herself married to a husband who seemed barely interested in her existence. To add to her difficulties, the members of the Danish court offered Caroline little sympathy, and her one ally, the lady-in-waiting Louise von Plessen, was banished in 1768 owing to some court intrigue. Eventually, after being persuaded that the succession had to be secured by producing an heir, Christian did his dynastic duty, and on the 28th of January 1768, Caroline gave birth to a son, the Crown Prince Frederick. With the succession now secure, however, Christian soon returned to his old habits, once again spending his nights in the brothels and taverns of Copenhagen. Not long afterwards, the king left his wife in Copenhagen with their infant son, and took off on a grand tour of Europe that lasted the better part of a year. During his absence, the young queen was accused of having an affair with Latour, a handsome French actor and singer. The allegation was likely untrue, but the gossip was damaging enough that Latour was exiled after Christian's return. Meanwhile, Caroline had begun forming friendships with women at court who were known for their romantic affairs, and encouraged her to dance, flirt, and enjoy a more active social life. But the most important consequence of Christian's journey was still to come. While travelling through Germany, rumour had it that the king's conduct became even stranger, and because of this his entourage hired a young physician named Johann Friedrich Struensee. Yet before long, he would become the man at the centre of a scandal that would destroy both himself and Caroline Matilda. Johann Struensee was born in the town of Halle in 1737 and went on to become a physician serving in the town of Altona. He ended up as a servant of the Danish crown after he was hired during Christian's travels in Germany, and he proved to have a rare capacity to manage the king's severe mood swings, gaining his confidence. Hence, when the court returned to Copenhagen in January 1769, he went with them and stayed on at the Danish court as a royal physician. At first, the queen treated the newcomer quite coldly. However, she warmed to him as Struensee seemed to be one of the few courtiers who urged Christian to show some greater kindness to his much-neglected wife, and the state of the marriage briefly improved. It wasn't long until Struensee gained a strong standing at court. In January 1770, he was given his own rooms at Christiansborg Palace, bringing the young physician into the heart of the royal household. At the same time, Christian VII was becoming increasingly passive and withdrawn as his mental health deteriorated, leaving more and more of the daily business of government in Struensee's hands. Then, in the spring, Struensee won Caroline Matilda's gratitude in a way that would bring them dangerously close. When smallpox swept through Denmark, he successfully inoculated the Crown Prince Frederick, saving the child's life. Caroline's trust in the charming physician deepened, and before long, that trust became something far more intimate. By the summer of 1770, the Queen and the King's physician were no longer simply close. Their affair had become an open secret. The affair might have been allowed to continue if it was not so politically sensitive. With her husband often incapacitated and Caroline becoming increasingly central to the running of government, concern grew amongst the Danish courtiers that Struensee, a foreigner, was basically becoming a power broker at the Danish court. In September 1770, the veteran foreign minister, Count Johann von Bernstorff, was dismissed, with suspicions that the German doctor was responsible for the decision, while in July 1771, a royal decree created Struensee as a minister, with the power to issue commands as though he did so with Christian's authority. Thus, For an extraordinary period of about 16 months after von Bernstorff's fall, a German doctor became the de facto ruler of Denmark, issuing over 1,000 decrees in the king's name. His policies were controversial and would transform Danish society. He abolished press censorship and attacked many of the privileges enjoyed by the nobility, while attempting to reform the harsh system of forced peasant labour. Of course, this made him powerful enemies among the conservative elite. And while he was reshaping the kingdom, Caroline Matilda was changing too. The young queen gained new confidence, riding astride on horseback and on occasions, appearing in male riding clothes. She also surrounded herself with people outside the traditional aristocratic circle, behaviour that only added to the growing scandal surrounding the queen and her controversial lover. But then came the moment that seemed to confirm the worst suspicions of Struensee's enemies. On the 7th of July 1771, Caroline Matilda gave birth to a daughter, Louise Augusta. Christian VII acknowledged the child as his own, but almost immediately, people at court began whispering that she was really Struensee's daughter. Behind closed doors, she was mockingly called La Petite Struensee. And the rumours did not stop there. Shortly after the birth, an even more explosive story began circulating. Caroline and Struensee supposedly intended to imprison the king and make Caroline regent of Denmark. The accusation was almost certainly absurd, but by then, the truth mattered less than what people were willing to believe. Ironically, Struensee's own freedom of the press was helping spread the stories that would destroy him. Copenhagen was flooded with pamphlets and newspapers mocking his relationship with the queen, while opposition at court gathered around the king's ambitious stepmother, the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, her son Frederick, and their advisor, Ove Guberg. Together, they were no longer simply plotting against the king's favourite. They were preparing to bring down the queen herself. The coalition that had built up against Caroline and her lover finally struck on the night of the 16th of January 1772 during a masked ball at Christiansborg Palace. Caroline danced until the early hours, completely unaware that conspirators were already making their move. Once the palace had fallen quiet, they entered the bedchamber of the terrified king and persuaded him to sign a series of arrest warrants, including one for Struensee. The doctor was seized in his bed and carried away to prison. Then, shortly before dawn, armed men entered the queen's own apartments. Caroline was arrested and, that morning, she was sent under escort to the fortress at Elsinore with only her infant daughter for company. Her young son, the heir to the throne, was left behind with his father. The questioning began almost immediately. After 3 days of intense interrogation, Struensee finally confessed to his adulterous relationship with the queen. In March, his signed confession was brought before Caroline. Realizing there was little point in denying it, she signed it herself. Perhaps she hoped that accepting the affair might save her lover's life, but if that was her intention, it failed. Struensee was placed on trial and executed on the 28th of April 1772. He was 34 years old. By then, Caroline was no longer Queen of Denmark and Norway. Her marriage to Christian had been dissolved on the 6th of April, and the fate of the young queen now rested in the hands of her brother across the sea. George III could do nothing to restore his sister's marriage or reputation, but the imprisonment of a British princess was considered a grave diplomatic insult, which could not be tolerated. Britain's envoy in Copenhagen, Sir Robert Murray Keith, threatened the Danes with a complete rupture in relations and possibly war if Caroline was not released. The Danish government eventually gave way. Caroline would retain the right to call herself queen, and her dowry would be returned. But there was a terrible price. She would have to leave Denmark, while her children would remain behind in Copenhagen. At the end of May 1772, a small British squadron anchored off Elsinore. Caroline boarded one of the ships and sailed into exile. She was just 20 years old, and she would never see her son or daughter again. Caroline did not return to England. Given the circumstances of her downfall in Copenhagen, Her brother George III felt that bringing his disgraced sister back to the British court would create an awkward and potentially damaging situation. Instead, she was sent to live in the old castle of Celle in Hanover, a territory controlled by the British royal family. There, Caroline established a small court and lived a secluded life, eventually reuniting with her former lady-in-waiting, Madame von Plessen. But Caroline had not been forgotten in Denmark. The new regime, dominated by Christian's stepmother, the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, soon became deeply unpopular. By the autumn of 1774, a group of Danish nobles was secretly plotting to overthrow the government and restore Caroline to Copenhagen as regent for her young son, while the increasingly incapacitated Christian remained king in name. Their intermediary was an English adventurer named Nathaniel Wraxall, who arrived to Celle to present Caroline with the extraordinary proposal. She was willing to consider it, and Wraxall was sent to London to seek the approval of King George III. For a brief moment, Caroline Matilda had a chance to return to Denmark, not as an exiled queen, but as its ruler. But before her brother could make a final decision, illness and death brought the entire scheme crashing down. In the spring of 1775, an epidemic fever swept through northern Germany, one that is generally identified as a wave of scarlet fever. In Celle, the queen caught the infection, and after a short illness, died on the 10th of May 1775 at just 23 years of age. A letter attributed to her on her deathbed protested her innocence to her brother, King George, one last time, yet there is no doubting Caroline's adultery of Struensee. She was buried in the vault of the church at Celle beside her great-grandmother, Sophia Dorothea, the former wife of the first Hanoverian King of England, George I, whose own story of adultery and punishment Caroline had largely repeated. In Denmark, Caroline's son finally seized control of the government in 1784 at just 16 years old, although his father, Christian VII, remained king in name until his death in 1808. Caroline's son then became King Frederick VI and would rule Denmark until 1839. Her daughter Louise Augusta remained at the Danish court and lived her entire life as the daughter of Christian VII, despite the widespread belief that Struensee had been her real father. In the end, Caroline Matilda never returned to Denmark and never saw either of her children again. She had been queen for barely 5 years, but her brief and scandalous reign left behind an affair, a political revolution, a disputed princess, and one of the most notorious chapters in Danish royal history. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Caroline Matilda. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. Also, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.